For the past several weeks, something unusual has been happening on Russian state television, in Washington briefings, and across social media commentary. Suddenly everyone is talking about a so-called peace initiative. At first glance, it looks like a breakthrough moment, a three-way alignment between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine that could theoretically end one of the most destructive conflicts of the 21st century. But once you dig even a little beneath the surface, it becomes clear that this initiative has nothing to do with peace. What we are witnessing is a sophisticated political maneuver crafted inside the Kremlin, one aimed not at ending the war, but at freezing it, reshaping global perceptions, and buying more time for Moscow's long-term strategic goals. This is not a peace plan. It is an information operation, a diplomatic smokescreen, and a calculated pause disguised as progress. To understand why this initiative suddenly appeared, you have to look at the timing. Russia is under growing pressure from sanctions that are finally beginning to work. Financial data from Minfin, reports from the CBR, business press, and even fragments of Rostat's revised numbers all point in the same direction. State revenues are strained, military spending is approaching Soviet-style levels, and critical shortages in equipment and labor are becoming harder to hide. At the same time, a quiet but dangerous fatigue is spreading across Russia itself. The enthusiasm that existed in 2022 is long gone. Now there is only obligation, fear, and resignation. People are tired of mobilization rumors, tired of rising prices, tired of young men disappearing into recruitment offices, and tired of waking up each morning to another government speech about historic duty. For a regime obsessed with the stability of public mood, this is a dangerous cocktail. Presenting a peace proposal, at this moment achieves two immediate goals for the Kremlin. First, it distracts from the new wave of sanctions that the West is coordinating. Instead of discussing Russia's economic vulnerabilities, global media suddenly shifts to discussing negotiations. Second, it allows Moscow to present itself as reasonable, responsible, and open to dialogue, while placing the burden of rejection on Kyiv and Washington. If Ukraine refuses the deal, Russian diplomats get to claim that it is Kyiv, not Moscow, that wants the war to continue. If Washington hesitates, they can say the US is sabotaging peace. The entire narrative is engineered to shift blame while changing none of Russia's fundamental demands. But the real strategy goes even deeper. The Kremlin understands that a frozen conflict is far more useful than a resolved one. A frozen conflict locks in territorial gains. It keeps Ukraine unstable. It divides Western allies over how to deal with a not quite war, not quite peace situation. And it ensures that Russia maintains leverage without needing to engage in large-scale offensives that are expensive, risky, and increasingly difficult to sustain. For a leadership that measures time differently than democratic governments, thinking in decades, not election cycles, maintaining a slow, grinding, neither peace nor war scenario is a perfect long game. This brings us to the core of Putin's strategy. Endless conflict helps him stay in power. Since 2014, every major domestic problem has been reframed as a result of Western aggression, NATO expansion, or Ukrainian hostility. War has become a political shield. As long as the conflict continues, Putin can justify mobilization, censorship, economic restrictions, and political oppression as necessary for national survival. Ending the war removes that shield. Freezing it keeps it intact. From the Kremlin's perspective, peace is dangerous, but controlled instability is useful. And here is the crucial point. Despite the big headlines, there is no genuine negotiation happening. The so-called plan is built on conditions that Ukraine cannot accept without surrendering its sovereignty, and conditions that Washington cannot endorse without provoking a political earthquake in Europe. The Kremlin knows this. The goal is not agreement, the goal is performance. Moscow is performing diplomacy while continuing to prepare for long-term confrontation. Inside Russia, this narrative is deployed as reassurance. We are trying to make peace, the West refuses, we have no choice but to continue. Abroad, it is used as division. Different Western countries have different tolerances for compromise, and the Kremlin hopes to amplify those differences. And in Washington, the plan is designed to tap into a growing desire among some politicians to reduce support for Ukraine, reduce foreign commitments, and redirect resources inward. Let's also talk about why I personally waited 2 weeks before analyzing this story. At first, the proposal seemed too obviously absurd to take seriously. It looked like one more piece of propaganda tossed into the global conversation. But then something interesting happened. Major news outlets began discussing it as if it were a real possibility, Western diplomats started referencing it indirectly, and Russian state media began framing it as a historic step. In other words, the story started to take on a life of its own, not because the proposal itself was legitimate, but because information operations don't require legitimacy to succeed. They only require repeated amplification. During those 2 weeks, I followed the chatter inside Russia, what people were thinking, what analysts were writing, what officials were hinting at. I spoke with contacts who live across the regions, people who work in the energy sector, people involved in the military supply chain, people connected to the ministries. They all said the same thing: nobody expects peace. Nobody is preparing for peace. But they are absolutely preparing for a long-term conflict that shifts between hot and cold phases depending on the Kremlin's needs. The peace plan is simply a temporary tool. From an American perspective, this is also a test. Washington's political environment has become increasingly polarized, and any mention of negotiation or compromise in Ukraine immediately becomes a domestic political weapon. The Kremlin knows this. By floating a proposal that sounds reasonable to some ears but is fundamentally unacceptable in practice, Moscow hopes to intensify divisions inside the U.S. political system. A divided America is less effective. A distracted America is predictable. And a predictable America is easier for the Kremlin to manipulate. Meanwhile, Ukraine understands exactly what is happening. A frozen conflict is a slow death for their sovereignty. It would leave millions of citizens under occupation, freeze their economy in uncertainty, and allow Russia to rebuild, rearm, and return later with even greater force. Kyiv has learned from history. Every time Russia has been given a pause, it has used it to prepare for the next wave of aggression. This time would be no different. There is another layer to this story: the Kremlin's internal audience. I often say that inside Russia, the regime must constantly manage mood, expectation, and fear. Peace talk gives exhausted Russians hope, even if the Kremlin never intends to deliver. It creates an illusion of progress. It allows people to believe the war might end soon without demanding political change. This is the psychological value of the peace initiative, not diplomatic but emotional. If people think the war might end, they are less likely to resist it. At the same time, the state uses fear as a counterweight. The message is, we want peace, but the West won't allow it. So prepare for more sanctions, more militarization, more economic sacrifice. This dual messaging, hope and fear, keeps society in a state of suspended animation. People do not rise up. People do not revolt. People wait. And while they wait, the Kremlin consolidates more control. Internationally, Russia's strategy also relies on fatigue. It knows that global attention spans are limited, that economic pressures soften political resolve, and that democracies struggle to maintain long-term commitments. Every delay, every negotiation, every fake peace proposal is designed to drain Western endurance. The longer the conflict drags on, the more likely it is that foreign governments shift their priorities, reduce support, and ultimately give Russia more room to maneuver. So what is the outcome of all this? Nothing immediate. That is the point. The peace plan is not designed to change the battlefield, it is designed to change perception. It is a narrative weapon. And narrative weapons are powerful, sometimes even more powerful than missiles. They influence elections, shape public opinion, affect aid packages, and determine how history is remembered. In the end, what we are witnessing is a classic example of Kremlin strategy: deny responsibility, shift blame, present illusions, create confusion, and buy time. Time is the key. The longer the conflict continues under controlled conditions, the more opportunities Russia has to strengthen its military production, deepen its alliances with countries like Iran and China, adapt its economy to sanctions, and prepare for a future in which confrontation with the West is permanent. For the Kremlin, peace is not the objective. Survival is. And that is why this initiative matters, not because it will end the war, but because it shows how the war will continue. Not with breakthroughs and dramatic offensives, but with slow, calculated political moves designed to reshape international perception while sustaining a conflict that benefits the regime. It is a reminder that in modern warfare, the battlefield is only one part of the fight. The information space is another. Diplomacy is another. Economics is another. And public psychology, inside Russia, inside Ukraine, inside the West, is perhaps the most critical front of all. As always, everything I share is based on open public data, reporting from Russian and international sources, and conversations with people still inside the country. There is no hype here, no exaggeration. Only analysis. And my conclusion is simple: there is no peace in Putin's peace plan. There is only strategy. If the world fails to understand that, this war will not only continue, it will evolve into something even more difficult to contain. But if we see the strategy clearly, if we recognize the pattern, then perhaps we can finally respond not to the illusion of peace, but to the reality of the threat behind it.